So, all right, so we are now recording. I was thinking it might be nice to start with just a little bit of silence and holding silence together for a minute or two, and just to observe our bodies and observe where our emotions are right now in our bodies, where the stress might be in the body, where the relaxation is. Just kind of breathe into your body and notice the breath going in, going out, and watch the breath and observe yourself in the room, in the space where you are, and just come as fully as you can just into the present moment in your body, in your whole self that is more than your body. So I'll give you another 30 seconds or so. Just keep observing yourself. Notice the sounds in the room. You're not separate from the room around you. You're part of that, or it's part of you, or the car you're in. Or the cat on your lap that is providing warmth. Feel it. It's part of you too. And when you're ready, open your eyes to join our group now of 6. So while we were doing that very short, kind of bring ourselves into the present, meditative mindfulness activity, my friend Joan Daigle joined us. And none of you know Joan, so I'm going to let Joan introduce herself before we get started here.
Hello, everybody. So I'm sitting at a gas station on my way home. And Robin and I have known each other for a very, very long time. We worked actually on a conference together in 2004, I believe that it was. 4. Yeah, in San Francisco, right? Mm-hmm. Called Investing in Socially Responsible Education. And the idea was that wouldn't it be wonderful if the interest in mindfulness and ecology would translate into an interest also in childhood and children and holistic education? And we shared that very strongly. So that's what I'm going to say about my introduction. As soon as I get home, I'll join you properly.
Okay.
Say hello, everybody.
Thanks, Joan. And we already did introductions before you joined us, so I'm not going to do them all again. But if you join us again for another session and come at the very beginning, you'll get to meet more people. And we'll get to know each other right now because we're going to have a conversation. I'm going to introduce it by talking about some of my own life and shifts that I've gone through a little bit. And how I'm continually revisiting this question about what it means to be a holistic educator and inviting you into that inquiry. So for me, it started when I started working with Paths of Learning, which was a magazine and online resource center that I helped to create about alternative holistic approaches to education. Sometimes holistic, sometimes other free schools, democratic schools, Waldorf schools, it was very encompassing. And I started visiting. I got a grant to do all this, and the little foundation that was helping me, that was publishing the magazine, and it was kind of a team of people. And during this time, I was a graduate student working on my PhD. And I just became fascinated that there were these other ways to learn. And I had never heard about them. I was about 30 years old and I had never heard about all these different approaches to education. And as I started visiting, I did similar to what Cam and Andrea did, where they traveled around the United States last year, but I did it more slowly over 2 or 3 years. I visited schools in Kansas City. I visited schools in New York. I visited schools in Maine and Vermont and Seattle and California. I would hear about a school and I would find a way to get there. Or I also started to attend a conference called the National Coalition of Alternative Community Schools. And the more I got involved in it, the more I realized that it wasn't like one thing. It was a whole bunch of different kinds of schools. And the quality of the education in each place was really, really different. And I started realizing I was more interested in the schools that were calling themselves holistic, but they were different. Even there, it was like these groups of, actually not even groups, they were mostly independent schools that had emerged in the 1970s and 1980s as wanting to be an alternative to mainstream education. But about that same time, I started working on my doctoral research in California. And I started to realize that holistic education wasn't about what's out there. It's about a transformative process of looking inward too. And the only way you can understand holistic education is from almost what I might call the inside out, that you have to look at yourself first. And constantly kind of, not in a critical, hyper stressful way, but in a way that allows you to become more of who you really are. And sometimes, like in my early 30s, that included psychotherapy and different things that helped me to come to terms with things from childhood and all that. But as the years went by, I kept realizing it never stops. There's just this constant learning in relationship to the other people around you. And the relational part of the learning, I started to realize, was really the center part for what I was understanding about what holistic education was. And I started thinking today about a book that I had edited years and years ago. I went and found it. It was on a bookshelf, well, on a bookshelf at work, but it's called Holistic Education by a really good friend of mine, Scott Forbes. Who did an analysis. He worked for many years at a Krishnamurti school. He worked with Jay Krishnamurti for 10 years before Krishnaji died. And so as I got to know Scott, I got to know a lot about the teachings of Krishnamurti. And I met him while I was working on my doctoral research, and he asked me to actually proofread this book. And so I've read the book a couple of times, and it's based on his doctoral research at the University of Oxford. It's really heavy, academically deep, and it analyzes 6 different authors, because over the years, many educators visited the school where he was, which was called Brockwood Park in England. They visited it because Krishnamurti was such a famous teacher. I don't even want to call Krishnamurti a philosopher. He was a wise human being who spoke about the nature of what it means to be a human being and how we need to use self-knowledge. And self-knowledge, not like in what my interests are, not what my strengths and weaknesses are, more the deeper kind of self-knowledge of this constant observation of the self. And so I met Scott, and he was writing this book, which has nothing to do with Krishnamurti, and yet it does completely. So here I was starting to immerse myself in the teachings of Krishnamurti, who is a holistic educator, and he founded 10 holistic schools around the world in his lifetime, mostly in India, England, and one in Southern California. But they're really non-dogmatic schools. They've been described as the methodless method. And that always appealed to me, like, okay, so holistic education, we have the Waldorf, the Montessori, and then we have these schools that it's not about the method that you're using to teach, it's about who you are as a teacher and bringing out the best in students and how that might be what shape and form that might take in England versus India versus America might be really, really different. So I just kept thinking, so then what does it mean to be a holistic educator? And in this book, it actually answers that question. It's and yet I hadn't looked at the book for 20 years. I proofread it 20 years ago. And now over the last 20 years, I've gone into life and had all these experiences in life. And I was wondering, does what he wrote in the book still speak to me? And I started to think more about it. And so I wanted to kind of share some ideas that were written about in the book that started to make more sense to me now as I grow older, and see if some of the ideas make sense to you, because to me, it's only in our own experiences and how we understand our own experience that any concept can come to life so that we understand it better. So one of the things I kept thinking about is, to be a holistic educator, I need to have a relationship to something greater than myself. And over the years, I kept realizing I am still so egocentric, and I still go back to the me all the time, and trying to realize and see my own egocentrism. And at the same time, let that go sometimes, because sometimes when you notice it, it just disappears a bit. And then there's that connection to something greater. And anyone who I've met who taught in schools that were more holistic seemed to have a connection to goodness, or to God, or to making even social justice, different issues, something that was bigger than just them alone. And that was an important part, it seems to me, about is having a concept that goes beyond the self of, and in Scott's book, he calls it ultimacy. And he cites authors that described ultimacy in lots of different ways, spiritual and non-spiritual, some psychological, like, what was it, Carl Rogers, what was his concept? It was, oh, one of you know this. Oh, you're on mute, Cam.
Unconditional positive regard.
Unconditional positive regard, but then there was that was the process of reaching it. But then there was the concept itself of, it's slipping from me. But a psychological state of being connected with others and yourself. So, and Abraham Maslow had a different term, and there were different terms that have been used across many years. And each one of us develop all this different kind of personal relationship to something that's greater than ourselves. And we define it and describe it in different ways. And that's okay. Again, I've traveled pretty widely in the world at this point, to a lot of Muslim countries and to several Buddhist countries. And I would meet people in traditional mainstream education who had this incredible rapport with students. And they also had a spiritual life, and both were important in their being an educator. So there's that relationship to the other, something greater. And then there's the relationship to the students and understanding the needs of students that seem to cross boundaries, that it's not about, yes, the content you're teaching is important, but the content is not as important as how you're helping students connect with something greater in themselves. So it's not about one thing or another, but it's understanding your students well enough to know what do they really need at a deeper level, not just academics, or not even just one content or another. And to connect with nature and how important that is. And so everything I keep looking at related to holistic education is about understanding the connections in yourself. And in the school where we worked in Thailand, it was hand, head, heart, knowledge, skills, and value. And yet, how do we do that? I mean, maybe the how is the wrong question. I'm not even sure. But there's just this feeling that that unity inside ourselves is important. And once we see it in ourselves, not always, sometimes we're very fragmented and we don't connect well with things and things are not going well. But sometimes we get in the flow. And when we're doing that with a group of students, how do we help them to connect with that unity inside themselves? So there's the relationship with the student, the relationship with something greater than ourselves, the relationship with our own learning process. And when we understand our own learning process, how does that help us to help students to understand their own unique learning processes, which is different than all other human beings. And so it's so interesting to me as I was looking at things I was doing, because I was working in international mainstream schools, IB, International Baccalaureate schools, and working with teachers and teaching teachers. And yet everywhere I went, I felt that holistic education isn't just about people who call themselves holistic educators. It's people who are connecting deeply with themselves, with their students, and with the greater community, either of humanity or the greater community of their school system sometimes. So, and so I'm going to just open the door, I guess, for questions instead of me just talking. I'm just kind of sharing some reflections. Oh, and one more thing, I guess, before I go on, is the book that I edited years and years ago was later, I was looking at it and he looked at 5 sagacious competencies. He used a sociological framework. And sagacious means sage from the word wisdom. So, and the sociological framework was very complex based on some work by Basil Bernstein. Looking at how time and space and relationships, when those change, how our social relationships change in different ways, and that holistic education itself was a different form of competence than other types of competence. And that's why he came up with the term sagacious competence, which had 5 layers to it, which was refining values, discovering and refining values. So not telling people what their values are, but leaving a door open for the discovery of values. Freedom and the ability to be psychologically free from authority. What's the, here, I wrote them down because I knew I'd forget what I'm talking. Good judgment, how to make good decisions, especially how to make good decisions in difficult situations, which we nowadays call resilience. The ability to meta learning, learning how to learn. So not just about, again, the content is secondary. What is important is that you know how to learn. And there's so many different ways that we learn how to do that. And then social ability, which in this context as a sagacious competence did not mean social skills. It was more than that. It was how do we be in society without being of society, so that we're not corrupted, because society has a tendency to do things that are corrupting also. I mean, that was written about years and years ago. It doesn't always bring us to our best person that we are. And so how to be in the society without being influenced by all the things that can bring us down, so that we're still our best self. That's how social ability was kind of looked at. So, okay, there's only 6 of us, so we're not going to go do breakout sessions or anything here. I just put out a lot of different ideas there. I guess the question right now for me is, what resonates for you when you think about what does it mean to be a holistic educator? What are the elements here that make up who we are as holistic educators?
One thing that always tends to resonate with me in these conversations is how important that connection to self you mentioned at the beginning is, and how do you coach that as a mentor? How do you teach educators going into public education that the self is probably the most valuable tool in education?
Mm-hmm.
So what struck me was the search that you went on, visiting all these different places and gleaning out what was the connecting sensibility, that there was a sense of there's more. And I have found a struggle in verbalizing what that more is. And finally gotten comfortable with the fact that if it wasn't so new, if it wasn't so different from the conventional idea of what education is supposed to be, we would have no trouble verbalizing it. But because it's new and we're making it, inventing it as we go along, and treading very carefully to be scientific on the one hand, and not go spiritual woo-woo, and yet there is that connection to the larger meaning of life, and yet we don't want to go around defining that for other people. So we find ourselves, I think, struggling with just how to verbalize it and not fall into, pitfalls of being too specific or not specific enough. And so to me, we are like, it's like the environmental movement. We're just learning what it actually means to take care of the earth and to be aware of that there's no scarcity. If we listen to nature, there's no scarcity. If we paid attention to children, we would realize there's no such thing as a child scarcity in childhood, that one child is better than another, or so it's like we're evolving a new sensibility and the language to go with it.
I'd like to add on to Joan's statement of the language to go with it. I think just giving kids, my passion has been mathematics advocacy to eliminate the math anxiety and fears and the statements of I can't do math, and parents telling their kids, well, I can't do math, so yeah, no wonder you can't do it. And I found that like the language is the empowering part of it, and restructuring the ability to give students and their parents, the correct language and more language and diverse language and the power that's in it to restructure everything in education is going to come down to the language. And using that language, you toe the line of like that new age spiritual thing of, when you have the exact language, you can be very direct. And that is where the power is going to lie for holistic education and restructuring everything in education.
Yeah, as Cam and I work toward starting a school, and I keep saying, oh yeah, it's going to be a holistic school, which then means, okay, we're going to be holistic educators. And then it's like, oh wait, I have to explain this to parents and other people who want to understand what that is. And yeah, that line between being understood and having language that is understandable so that others can step into what you're trying to share, but also recognizing that with too much language and too much specificity, it robs it of what it really is. So that idea of values being created, not told, I mean, that's really interesting. And this sense of wanting to uncover this mystery of what holistic education and what being a holistic educator means is like, it feels just like this lifelong journey, and comes back maybe to that understanding of the self again, is that I, as a holistic educator, have to keep being on that journey, because as soon as that stops, then yeah, I don't feel like I can say that anymore. And that sense, Robin, of holistic education always feels like it's something beyond. It's always, it's a connection to something that's not right here and right now, and it's not so tangible. It's something that, yeah, it's a connection to that which is beyond us, and even a connection to that which is beyond us on the internal side as well. It's not just who I am and what my name is and what my background is. There's a deeper exploration that has to happen within, and then also that deeper connection without that translates to our students. And if we can do that within ourselves and understand some of that depth, that way when we see our students, for example, struggling, maybe they're struggling with math, and it's not about math, it's about the message that they've received from parents, and being able to like constantly have this process of seeing deeper and seeing beyond what is right there. That development toward, maybe it's kind of it's intuition. It's a sense that is not one of the five senses. It's a sense beyond that I feel is something I want to keep developing.
Yeah, for me, one of the things that stands out is the relationship piece of it. So in working with adolescents, that 12 to 17-year-old age range tends to be quite rebellious, and it can be very challenging of authority in a lot of ways. And if the young person, if they don't have a good sense of trust or faith or appreciation or some kind of enjoyable perspective of the teacher, of who they're working with, of whose presence they're sharing, they can quite quickly turn it off, and it almost seems to disappear if that relationship bond isn't there. And so, yeah, I think this deep inquiry into the self, I think, starts in relationship. At least it does for me. And just going back to what you were saying about that, Robin, it really seems like the fundamental piece of all like holistic exploration.
Thank you. I was taking notes because my memory is not always very good, so I like to jot down key ideas that people were saying. So I'm just kind of watching the thread that of Julissa, starting with so how do we even educate for holistic educators, because it has all this complexity, and then Joan noticing how kind of I've gone through a journey of discovery, but that there's this newness to what we're doing. And I feel it is new and it's not new, but we always have to discover it as new. And that mentality of no scarcity that the earth provides for itself, just as children in a preschool or a kindergarten room, if you put them to playing, they do provide for themselves. And they learn from playing and doing all kinds of things. And yet the holistic educator is important at the same time, because they're part of that whole learning process. And then Catherine was talking about the elimination of fear and the importance of language and how we experience things. And I notice as we're all talking, how we're being careful with the words that we're using, because there is an awareness that this is a difficult thing to talk about. And there's not a right or a wrong, and we all kind of have to come to it in our own way. And then Andrea talking about, yeah, and so now I need to learn how to describe this to our parents. How are we going to talk about this? And yeah, I mean, if parents want to know the content and what the direction we're going, and yet you're guiding students to discover those values and create them, And so there is this constant uncovering of this mystery. Those were some of the words Andrea used, of seeing oneself as being more than who one is. And then you use the idea of intuition too, Andrea. And before we get to intuition, I also want to go backwards to the perception, the five senses. And I got to observe Andrea's kindergarten classroom last year. And one of the things they did really, really well in Thailand, the kindergarten where she taught in Thailand, was getting children to do self-observation constantly through all of the senses, and not, limiting one sense or another sense. And I sometimes wonder if part of being a holistic educator is there are the five senses, and then we can go maybe beyond that, maybe. But we often aren't even tuned into our five senses. We're using thoughts so much. And we haven't talked about that yet, but that's another thing Krishnamurti writes about a lot and speaks on extensively, is the limitations of thought. And yeah, so I've just gone all over the board, kind of trying to summarize some of your main ideas, but then starting to see how it's trickling down into me too. And so it led me to this whole another idea of, if we're going to develop our intuition, do we have to develop our other perceptions? And understanding what we ourselves have to develop would then help to answer Jalisha's question about what on earth how do we educate for holistic education? Because it's, I think intuition is very complex. And where does that start?
What you're saying reminds me of something that I read in the Wall Street Journal right after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And we all know that things didn't turn out as, hopefully as we thought it would, but at the time, and there was a question from a kindergarten teacher who had been teaching under, the old system, right? And she said, so now what do I do? How do I teach differently if we're free? How do I teach for freedom? Do I just let the children do what they want? I just thought it was just a beautiful, really original question coming out of a paradigm shift where you suddenly don't know where you're swimming.
And it occurs to me we need to be in that space of not knowing. Because when we start to define it too much, then we have so many good examples of systems that are too defined in education, and that becomes a dogma. And Joan is very active in the Waldorf system, but I would give that as one example of a system that has at times become too rigid. But I think almost every system that becomes a system, there's a rigidity, and how do we as the individuals within that keep that flexibility of that state of not knowing?
Yeah, and if we're only perceiving ourselves as, these egos, these solid selves that have these bodies, and this is the extension of me, and that's, and there's a certainty to that, and it kind of caters to the mind's ability to like to find certainties. And then we look towards teachings, or we look towards examples or models or techniques, and we like the certainty that they provide, because that certainty is just something that works really well. It fits, it's engineered like that. It's, it's mechanized in a way. But when we introduce topics like intuition, uncertainty, not having rigidity, freedom, these things, the mind doesn't do very good at grasping because they inherently have a lot of space in between them. And I think we come from a culture, a social systems that, trains us mostly to, go towards the certainty, go towards, being able to know the things is what we need to do. And if we can just know all the things, we'll be good human beings in this world, and that's that. But then asking the question, is it, or is being human, something more than we could ever know?
Cam, I love you.
I love you too, Robin.
Whenever I listen to you speak, you always bring that bigger perspective that it just, yeah. Cam and I used to have lots of good conversations at a picnic table next to a beautiful pond in Thailand.
That we did.
So, yeah, so we're kind of stuck. We're human beings who have technological brains that want certainty. And yet to be a holistic educator, we have to almost be willing to step outside of that. And to even challenge our own capacity to do that. Sometimes we can, sometimes we don't do it so well.
Still be in a society that wants certainty.
Yes.
Yeah, a society that even like at SOU, we have a certificate of holistic education. You take this class and that class and that class, and that's how you learn to be a holistic educator. And it's great, and I'm glad we're doing it. But is there more to it than those classes? And I also am curious too, because we have 2 students in our SOU certificate program here, Joan. Is any of the stuff that we're talking about things that you talk about in your holistic education classes?
Are you asking me specifically?
No, I'm asking Jalissa
Asking
and
everyone.
Catherine because they're the ones in the classes.
It's funny that you mentioned that, Robin, because I started immediately going to how confusing it might be holistic education when we try to adopt social emotional learning as the substitute for the essence of holistic education and what it means to be a holistic educator. And I mean, Catherine and I are beyond lucky to have Dr. Green and you and Dr. Renee Owen and Ronnie Adam to be there to facilitate these kind of transcendent moments in education. But I forgot your question, but it is a little bit problematic that we facilitate holistic approaches in this very objective social emotional capacities and curriculum that we've used as a model. But I also believe that it's the right step in the right direction to bring it into public education, that the deeper meaning and the deeper sense of self.
Mm-hmm. Catherine, what about the school where you're going to be working at Willow Creek? Is that a public or a private school?
It is a public school, and it's going to be a very unique situation of one, it's split, it's about 50 kids, so that small education value is there, so we can have really interpersonal relationships. But I didn't realize the importance of having administrators to support this idea is crucial. And I learned that in a practicum setting at another public school in the area, where an administrator told me that I was doing it wrong and I needed to stop being so nice. Also, while buying a new curriculum for social emotional learning to have the teachers do during homeroom, because bullying and everything is just running rampant at that school. It's like a very mixed message thing. And I almost thought I needed to drop out because I was like, well, maybe I'm not even going to get a job here. Because he was like, you can't do this. You can't do it. That's not what you do. And at the end of the day, the whole interaction was that I had a student who, he was in the room for when that happened, and he threw a chair at me. And I, got the chair and I put it down, and I told the kid, I was like, hey, Go get a drink of water, go cool off, come back and sit down. But you're not going to hurt yourself, your friends, or myself in this classroom. And the kids stormed off and left, and everyone continued their lessons. And the principal told me that that's not how you handle that situation. You match his energy with his energy. You can't be a teacher with this attitude. And I felt really bad for the rest of the day. But then after sixth period, that same student came back to apologize to me. And I was like, Mrs. G, I don't want you to think that's who I am. I'm just used to every teacher being mean to me before I get a chance to be mean. And you're always kind. And I'm sorry. And then he left. And I wanted to tell the principal about that meeting, but the principal had gone home for the day. And I was like, you know, my gut was telling me like I was doing it right. And then that interaction let me know, like, I think I'm doing it right. Like, yeah, there's hard moments, especially if it's ground shaking and new to those kids. But admin needs to be with you. And so there needs to be like holistic administrators too, beyond the classroom experience to support it all the way from we're educating us as students. And now we're at the scary part of I'm graduating this year, Jalissa next year. We're going to go into the field. Are we going to have administrators who support us, or is that going to chase us out of the industry?
Wow, thank you, Catherine, for bringing us into reality here. That was a beautiful story you just told. And I think the student told you everything you needed to know at the end of the day about how you did things just right.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. And it's a good example that we can have holistic educators, even if the administrators aren't holistic. But when you start to get those others supporting you, it makes so much bigger difference too. Yeah. Thank you.
A good reminder of why these types of discussions are important, because like Catherine even inspired me, and it feels like, yeah, we need to feel supported. And sometimes that support isn't directly in our community or in our administration. And to have you share a story like that, and like I think all of us could really feel that experience. That was really meaningful. Yeah, just a reminder that like, we're not alone, and this is like an ongoing journey to be reinforced in that.
Have any of you ever heard the term adultism in relationship to education? Well, I just ran across it just the other day doing some research, and apparently, it's a word that means, you know, when adults go, because I'm the grown-up, that's why. So we play the adult card as a power trip over the child, and their case is that leads. That's the beginning of the, you know, school to prison pipeline, where, as you were saying, Catherine, the principal or whoever that leader was at the school was saying you can't do it like that. You have to meet that in some, and the word that they used for it is carceral way, because it leads to incarceration or some sense that the child feels imprisoned by the power that you are exhibiting simply because you're, you know, the grown-up and you have the power. And I'm going to close this thought with since you mentioned my connection to Waldorf. Apparently when the first Waldorf school started in 1919 in Germany, Rudolf Steiner was describing the kind of education, what he meant by holistic education, developmental and all that. And then a parent raised their hand and said, well, yeah, but like, what's going to be like the big difference between what happens at the Waldorf school and where we are now? What's going to be the really big difference? He said, well, there will be no knuckle rapping at the Waldorf school. And in those days, knuckle rapping or spanking of children was rampant. He said, there'll be none of that at the Waldorf school. And apparently the room fell silent. And the parents were saying, well, then how will they learn?
Yep.
And that was 100 years ago. That story came from 100 years ago, yeah?
That story came from literally 100 years ago.
You know, we really are changing as a society, and sometimes we don't ever step back and say, things are really different than they were 100 years ago. And the fact that Catherine and Jalissa, you're taking a certificate in holistic education and you're learning about social emotional learning, and that all of the classes at SOU in one way or another seem to integrate social emotional learning issues and leveling the playing field so that we're not always exerting adult authority, like this is the way it needs to be, but having open discussions, like what we're doing right now. There's not just us doing it, there's a lot of people having conversations that say, you know, we want to change, we want to do things differently, and then taking action and making change and being the change and all of those good expressions.
Yeah.
But yeah, that how does right action for educating students or educating teachers, where does that come from inside of us? And it seems like it comes in that right relationship. And that takes a long time to develop and change the bigger systems when we're doing it in that way. And maybe it's not even the systems we need to change. Krishnamurti would always say it always comes back down to the individual, and we need to change ourselves.
But I think at some point, the system also we need to change the system while we're changing ourselves as well.
I think it happens. They go together.
Yeah.
Almost.
I mean, who creates the system?
What?
I kind of wonder, like, who creates the system? We do.
Yeah.
If we change ourselves, then will it trickle up, trickle down? I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah. I have a friend that keeps reminding me that I'm doing great work. She says, you don't tell yourself that enough. I was like, no, I don't know. I'm just doing things day to day and week to week. But to me, it's not about me. It's how are we working together and learning about each other and learning in relationship. And it's just happening so slowly that we don't notice it, but it is happening. So anyway, I'm not sure. It's 5:30, so I should be mindful of time. We said this would be a 1 hour thing. I want to invite everyone to keep coming back. Usually this will be on Saturdays on the Pacific Coast, Saturdays every other week from 5:30 to 6:30. 2 weeks ago, Cam and Andrea hosted the first one or facilitated the first one. It was a wonderful discussion. The discussion feels to me like one of those rivers that you're not quite sure where it's going exactly. And it doesn't have a definite outcome either. But I feel like we're engaging each other in good questions and issues, and what different people say triggers and trickles into each of us in different ways. So I hope that Catherine and Joan, it was the first time you joined, and I hope you can join us again.
And I think it's 4:30 for you, right? Is it 4:30 to 5:30?
Is that what I said? Did I not say?
5:30.
Oh, sorry. I was just
Yeah.
thinking right. You're right. It is 4:30 to 5:30. Thank
For
you.
us, it's a little later, but
I'm not, I get in a certain state of mind and I get not being time oriented.
So I just have to say that I have a daughter who, I'm in LA, have a daughter who lives in Boston, haven't seen her or the grandchild in 2 years. And they're coming on Wednesday. They'll be here for 2 weeks. So that probably is going to take priority. But
Sure.
thank you for the reminder, Robin.
Yeah, in 2 weeks, it's going to be 2 of our friends from the kindergarten in Thailand.
it's Tobin.
Oh, no? Is it
Yeah,
Tobin?
next week is Tobin.
Oh,
you sure?
okay. I was thinking
Yeah.
it was Fern and I thought Tobin was
I
the
am like
next one after that.
95% sure. It's
Okay,
just-
well, every
the
2
window.
weeks, Andrea's lining up really good facilitators every couple weeks, so,
Yeah,
Tobin.
it's Tobin Hart.
okay.
Councilman
and he-
Melissa, it was good to meet you. And Andrea and Cam, is it?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, I didn't add my name. Nice to meet you, Joan.
Hey, we're in this world together, this brave new world together.
Jalissa, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted your permission about including the holistic education discussion in our newsletter we're going to send out.
Yeah.
Just as a blurb, or if there's anything, any details. I just picked up that paragraph on your website on your holistic education discussion that says what this group is ought to, or not ought to, but what this discussion is supposed to be facilitating. Yeah, cool. Thank you.
Please, everyone
Thank
is
you.
invited. Share, share, share.
I have another question. Joan, before you joined us, we all agreed to record it because Cam wanted the recording. But you weren't in on that. So Cam, can you tell us what the recording might be used for? We
Just so
didn't
you
even
know,
ask that.
I did get a notice when I came on that it was being recorded, and so I was aware.
Okay,
Yeah, I mean, I didn't really have a plan for the recordings yet.
okay. All right. But so anyway, I'm going to forward it to Cam and Andrea and we're going to trust them to use it in a good way.
Yes.
Okay. All right.
Join us in 2 weeks for Tobin, a conversation with Tobin. There's not really a topic. It's just he wants to open the room for questions and just facilitate whatever arises. So I said, sure, Tobin, that sounds great.
Tobin
All right.
Hart.
Yes.
Yeah. Do you know Tobin?
Yeah.
Yeah. It is a small world, the world of holistic education.
Right, well, when we were in connection with Ron Miller, I met a lot of people, including you.
Yeah. All right. So see you all
Good night.
the next
Thank you,
session,
Robin.
I hope, as possible. All right. Thank you for
Thanks
coming.
thanks.
Thank
Yeah,
you,
thanks, Robin.
Everyone. Yeah.
Bye-bye.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
I wanted to stay on and talk to whoever's going to stay on.
Okay.
Okay. Anyway, I was going to ask Cam a question, but since you're on, thank you so much for joining. It was really nice.
Because it was on my schedule, but then it's, Sunday. Blah. Anyway,
Yeah.
I'm
I thought my friend Debbie would join because she said she was going to, and then all of a sudden you texted me back and said, I'm coming. It's like, oh, nice.
yeah. So there
Yeah.
you are, settled in Portland.
No, Ashland.
Sorry, Ashland.
Yeah. I wish it were Portland sometimes. I do miss Portland. I liked it a lot. But Ashland is a really nice community. It's a small community as opposed to Portland. And I just moved into this new digs last weekend. So I was in SOU housing up until last weekend.
Okay, so you're settling in
Yeah,
as the world is turning.
yeah. And just getting used to teaching here is interesting. I had a really good session yesterday where I teach satellite students who are adult learners in local communities 2 or 3 hours from Ashland, around the Southern Oregon, Northern California area. It was my first session with them, and it went really well. And at the end of the session, I get done, I was like, why did that go so well? What was going on? Why was it? Everything was just clicking, and they were connecting with each other, and they knew each other, but I didn't know them.
So it sounds like there's a lot of interest in this topic and how we manifest this together somehow.
Well, there's about, I think, 20 or 25 students who belong to the holistic education group. And then on our committee, we have about 40 of us. And the committee includes mostly people around Ashland who are involved with SOU. But then we have connections with schools. Each one of us have different connections with different kinds of schools all over. So yeah, and like this Willow Creek, the one that Catherine is going to work at. I just met Catherine, by the way. So there's lots of students here I haven't met yet. She's in the club and I didn't know her. But yeah, it seems that there's a strong intention to create a movement among the people who are part of the holistic teaching
Right.
and learning center here in Southern Oregon.
Yeah.
And then Cam and Andrea, gosh, if you haven't looked at their blog yet, wow.
Okay.
They connect, they have this synergy about them where they just know they connect with the right people who send them on to the next people. And they traveled around the United States last year visiting holistic schools, and their website showed, I still need to get into it. I've only read about 3 or
What's their
4.
website?
It's whatever you clicked in to get into here. It's like education and being.
Okay.
Yeah, the holistic education discussion is one tab of their website. If you
Okay.
go to the blog tab, you'll start to see some about their travels and the people they met. And last week, 2 of the other friends that they had met on their journeys were part, or 2 weeks ago, were part of our discussions. And they were both Waldorf teachers, or at least one was, and the other might have been like a school that's a Waldorf variation or something.
It's happening quite a bit that former Waldorf teachers just decide to go and teach in other holistic schools or in just regular schools and just bring what they've got, which makes perfect sense. That's one way for things to change. And then, the Waldorf system has taken quite a turn. I think partly the pandemic had us get off of this thing we don't.
I'm still recording. I'm going to stop recording.
Okay.